Welcome to the COSIN podcast, produced in partnership with MindRocket Media Group, the worldwide leader in demand generation, communication outreach, and thought leadership in education. COSIN represents over 13 million students in districts and educational institutions nationwide and continues to grow as a powerful and influential voice in K-12 education. This high-profile podcast series showcases industry thought leaders and executives who provide timely market insights and key guidance on various educational technology strategies.
We are excited to bring you part 2 of a 3-part series on K-12 education and cybersecurity. In part 1, we discussed new dangers from news sources, and today we'll be expanding the conversation to exposing hacker ecosystems. Our first guest is John Frangos. John is the Director of Cyber Threat Analytics at Telos Corporation. He is a former Army Chinese Mandarin linguist and technical targeter with 10 years of experience in the intelligence community. He specializes in data analysis and observation, analysis and exploitation of network communications. John directs the analytic functions and integrations within the Advanced Cyber Analytics team at Telos. Welcome to the podcast, John.
Hello, and thank you for having me.
Also joining us is James Levija. James is the Director of Digital Threat Identification at Telos Corporation. He was active duty Army intelligence for 8 years and now serves in the Army Reserve. He has 11 years of experience in the intelligence community working on targeting and exploitation. James's primary focus is fusing open source intelligence and dark web research as part of the Telos Advanced Cyber Analytics solution. Welcome to the podcast, James.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Every time a hacker connects to a network device or user, they leave a digital fingerprint. The challenge is finding these prints in the massive data logs and identifying the patterns and contexts that lead you to cyber criminals. Today's podcast will introduce you to new tools and techniques for finding and exposing hacker ecosystems. As we begin today's discussion, I'd like to ask you both to share your definition of what a hacker is and why it's so important in K-12 education.
I think there's really two fundamentally different angles to look at this. One simply being, the canonic definition as a hacker is someone who uses a computer or a network to gain unauthorized access to information, right? The other side of that is, often you have friends or family who, say, oh, my Facebook got hacked, right? Well, more often than not, while it could have been a data breach, a hacker got access to Facebook's data, but more often than not, that is simply due to individuals acquiring data available to gain access to your account, compromised, username as passwords and things like that, or aggregating personal data about you to gain access to your account. And really, that's not necessarily a hack. That's user negligence that leads to their data being compromised. But I do, in the canonic definition of a hacker, think that should be included in here because, in that case, the negligence allowed their data to become accessed. So I think that's kind of where I draw the line into two different angles there.
And I kind of piggyback on what John said. So hackers, they kind of vary. So you have ethical hackers they get permission from a company and then they go through and do their stuff to help benefit the company. Then you have the bad side where they try to do the legal stuff. Hacking, it's not necessarily just on the computer. You also have people who are very good at social engineering, which is essentially it's hacking humans. So you're just getting information from a human, you're taking that to your advantage, and you're using that information to then use a computer and gain access to either an account or a network, something similar to that. So those are some big threats. And then on top of that, you also have individuals who hack, and then you have groups. So there's APTs that work, or advanced persistent threat groups that work specifically for a government. Or you have just these hacker groups that do it for enjoyment, and then hacktivists who do it just because they're trying to do something good in the world.
Interesting. So let's go back to what you said, hacking humans. That sounds really ominous. Can you dive into that real quick and what that means?
Social engineering, basically, it's a way to take advantage of someone's emotions to get more information from the person. So if you're trying to find out information like might be security questions for an account. So if you have a dog, someone might bump into you. They might try to just ask you random questions, spark a conversation, or they start talking about their dog. They say, oh yeah, what do you have a dog too? And then you're kind of like just kind of playing into it. You're going with the conversation. Then you give your dog's name. Well, that is potentially a security question on an account. So that's something someone who's doing social engineering will kind of take note. Social engineering happens a lot with businesses where the person will actually try to use emotion and a sense of urgency to try to take advantage of a person to get more information. So there was this really interesting YouTube video that I saw where this lady was trying to gain access to someone's bank account. So what she did was she played in the background the sound of a crying baby. And then she was talking to this bank and she kept saying like, oh, I'm trying to get my baby. Sorry, it's so loud. My husband reset the password. I don't know what the password is. I just need to get back into my account so I can transfer some money. And then the person on the other line was trying to talk and you still hear this loud crying baby. And they're like, I'm really sorry. I need to hurry up. Can you please just give me the reset so I can put my baby down to sleep? And then she got the password. So things like that, that's where people take advantage of sense of urgency and people's emotions to get what they need for information.
That also ties into James's point about user negligence, right? Sorry, John's point about user negligence. And this goes to the importance of usernames and passwords, right?
Yeah, so it can tie into that. So like not reusing the same password is something that you definitely wanted to take care of. But so it's not always just on the onus of the specific user who owns the account. There's also people used to use a trick where they would call Google and they would take advantage of the employees at Google to take over an account. So you still have to worry about that as well. And then the user negligence, you always want to stay on top of monitoring your accounts to make sure it's not getting taken over.
Telos Corporation is a global cybersecurity technology and solutions company. For over 50 years, Telos has been delivering innovative products to K-12 education, commercial enterprises, and government customers around the world. Our Exacta cybersecurity management software platform improves cyber hygiene and compliance through our automated cyber controls and continuous monitoring. Telos Ghost is a network service that hides users and network-attached devices. Telos Advanced Cyber Analytics is a data service that can expose cyber criminals attempting to infiltrate your IT systems. To connect with Telos, visit telos.com.
John, this question for you. What is a digital fingerprint and what does it look like?
So ironically, this kind of can piggyback right into what James was just talking about, right? So a lot of the times when, on that topic of hacking humans, a lot of the times, before I get into exactly that definition, but you can use a digital fingerprint to identify the people that you want to personally hack, so to speak, right? Do what James just described, going up and gaining information through people based on identifying them through this digital fingerprint. So digital fingerprint, more or less, I think I'll just read you a definition because it does a very good job here. It is a procedure that maps an arbitrary large data item to a much shorter bit string. It's a fingerprint that uniquely identifies the original data for all practical purposes, just as human fingerprints uniquely identify people for practical purposes. So just as we all have, completely unique 100% identifiable fingerprints on our human fingers, so too does the data, right? Now, in the mass sea of data that exists, just an incalculable amount, right? It becomes difficult when looking at it holistically to really pull anything valuable out at a first glance. But once you start using, now in the age of, everybody hears these big ticket buzzwords, machine learning, ML, AI, right? Well, that's what you use to create, algorithms to identify these strings of information that attribute people to groups, right? And so that digital fingerprint is, for lack of better terms, identifiers for patterns in data, right? And so for when it comes to people, that could be anything from, when I drive to work, right? There's a Chipotle along the way. I personally really love Chipotle. So I will often stop at this Chipotle on my way back from work. I will buy a burrito or two, maybe a bowl and a burrito, doesn't matter, right? And then I'll go home, right? Well, over the course of me driving to work, the algorithms that identify user bases notice that, and now I start getting advertisements and discounts to go to Chipotle. I personally like that because I love Chipotle, right? However, that same set of data that is being used the advertisers are using to send targeted, highly catered specific ads to you or me, me and my Chipotle, right, can be used for very nefarious things, right? So the fact that, it takes me this amount of time to drive to work, that I drive by Chipotle or Starbucks, or usually spend 17 minutes in Walmart as opposed to like an hour because I like to get in and out of populated places quickly, are all pieces of information that will digitally identify me and create a unique signature for me or people like me in that vast swath of data, right? So the data that advertisers and marketers use to target individuals for ads is the same data that a hacker, or in the case of James and my own work, use to create metrics to facilitate the data to do what we want it to do. Now, if you're a nefarious person and you have access to that data, I can then say individuals who live in high income housing areas, right, who frequent this office building that is owned by Microsoft or Facebook or Google, right, spend this amount of time at work, frequent very expensive locations, probably can identify that that is now an executive. Now, if I understand the route that that person goes to do that, I can say this is likely an executive at one of those companies, and they go to a park on Saturdays. Again, because this is all just data that is accessible to people. If you have the money to buy it, you can get it, right? Or if you have the expertise to acquire it illegally, you also have it, right? But let's just say that that all happens, right? And now we take James's example of, well, now that I've identified that this is an executive and they go to a park on Saturdays, I can now approach them and their family, strike up a conversation, and gain the information that I need, right? Or, for a corporate espionage standpoint, if I know that that's the place they like to go, I can bug it and just snatch all their credentials that way, right? So the digital fingerprints are ways that what makes you unique in the infinite mass of data that there is.
That was a really good explanation. And I like that you tied it together with not just the digital part, but then also using that digital information to connect with someone personally.
Can I add something to
Sure.
There's a company called Electronic Frontier Foundation. They look into privacy stuff a lot. They take privacy pretty serious. So they always try to educate people more on privacy. So to kind of go along with John's digital fingerprint definition and everything with that, there's a way you can actually kind of see some of these fingerprints. So there's a website called coveryourtracks.eff.org. You can actually use it. It'll test your browser. It'll go through, it'll look at like the plugins and stuff like that you have. And then it will tell you how unique you are amongst everybody on the internet with your browser. So if you like change things on your browser, that kind of stands out. It'll tell you different types of data that gets passed around. And then you can actually see your unique fingerprint and how unique you are amongst other people.
So I'm willing to bet that many of our listeners would like to know what kind of data is particularly vulnerable to attack in the K-12 space. And I'll open this question up to you both.
One piece of information that I think would stand out, particularly in the K-12 space, because I'll just say in a corporate environment, one of the largest barriers to applying new emerging practical solutions is ego, to be completely honest, right? And so a lot of the time people think that they want to believe that they're the best, but if we just look last year, Microsoft, Facebook, Kaseya, right? Like if these people are getting hacked, everybody can be hacked, right? Now, the opposite is the case for children or K through 12. So not necessarily the architects, of their security environments, but the users therein, right? Because a child does not have the understanding to well, okay, some do. Let me quantify that. But generally speaking, they're not going to be concerned with the metadata and metrics and log analysis, whatever you want to is there going on in the background with what they use their device for. So I'm going to make this relate this to a military thought. If I'm trying to find someone or identify someone who is extremely and exceptionally tech savvy, proficient at hiding, masking, their behaviors, attributes, etc., I'm not going to use my resources or efforts to find, locate, identify them. I'm going to look at their family, right? Not to, target them, but because they will not have the same security practices as that individual, right? So in that environment, if I'm trying to gain access to a K through 12 network, I'm not going to attack it head on, right? I'm going to be looking at the users, the devices the kids have in that network, right? They're going to be downloading games. They're going to be clicking links in emails. They might not be, completely exposed to how phishing and spam emails look as opposed to us. I see something and it's spelled wrong. I'm not going to click it, right? It looks just like my Amazon cart, but it's not, because it's a picture as opposed to, like an embedded water print or something like that, right? So these are the kind of things where the network is vulnerable and susceptible, not because the infrastructure or security practices are incorrect, but because the user base potentially will let those threats in.
James, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so the type of data and stuff that's vulnerable, it's pretty much all the data. So hackers, they like to look at things and they try to find the easiest thing they can grab, the low-hanging fruit. So essentially, a lot of times the way they target, they're not targeting specifically for a school. They're not really targeting specifically for a business, not all the time. Most of the time they're just using an open scan. They're scanning the internet, looking for where something's vulnerable, and then they're going to try to attack it then. So that is one of the ways where on how they pick places. So ways the K-12 space would be vulnerable there is if the networks aren't fully being secure and there's some CVEs that might be vulnerable on the network, and a hacker finds it while they're scanning, and then they can take advantage of it that way.
What's a CDE?
CVE, it's a critical vulnerability.
And what's an example of that?
Back in December, there was a huge exploit on Log4j. Basically, what Log4j is, it helps manage Apache, and a lot of Linux-based systems use Apache to run a lot of things. A lot of websites are ran on Apache, different things like that. So there was this critical vulnerability where a hacker can gain access with Log4j so they can start taking over some of those services that Apache is offering. So they would essentially be able to take a lot of data just by exploiting that Log4j critical vulnerability.
That kind of leads into our next question for either of you. What kinds of cyber criminals and criminal activity do you typically uncover?
So this is a pretty wide variety. So I surf around on the darknet quite a bit as trying to fuse data between things. So a lot of things that you'll see is going through the darknet, you'll see a lot of data for sale. A lot of criminals, they will try to get into a company and then they're going to extract the data and then they'll sell all of that data to somebody, especially things that are of interest. So if it's like a crypto company, they'll try to get that information so then people can take advantage of the data from the crypto company. And then those people taking advantage of that data, they'll start targeting the people who have a significant amount of Bitcoin so they can start stealing money. Other types of activity is people will just want to deface a website. So if there's a vulnerability on a website, someone will go on it, they'll hack into the website, they'll deface it, and then just kind of leave their mark and leave. So it's very wide ranged on the type of activity. And then another one of the biggest ones is just trying to get into setting up a network of bots so they can take control and access over different computers belonging to different organizations. So they'll set up essentially a botnet where they can have command and control and tell the computers to do what they want when they want to.
If I can throw one last thing on the end of that, right? James started, his response to this with, all the data is vulnerable, right? Ultimately, that is going to be true in every sector of business, in every environment, right? Data is the real estate of the digital environment. Everyone always says, we'll buy real estate. Real estate always appreciates. Well, data is kind of the same thing when it comes to user-based and derived data. The longer you have it, the more you have of it, the more you can identify, the more it's worth, because the more pieces you can put together. And so if you have that, or you can get that, it's worth a lot. And it's going to always and continue to be worth a lot.
COSIN is the premier membership organization designed to meet the needs of K-12 education technology leaders. Their resources support the entire IT infrastructure of the school system. COSIN offers members access to their thought leaders across the country and the ability to actively participate in local COSIN chapters. Join the network today by visiting cosin.org and become another influential voice in K-12 education.
My last question is for both of you. What are the number one things school districts should be doing to deter cyber criminals and protect their sensitive data?
It's all about managing the devices, essentially, trying to remove some of that threat surface where the devices are vulnerable. So a big thing with when COVID was going on and a lot of students were home, they were sent home with an iPad or some sort of computer, something like that, so they can work remotely on their schoolwork. One of the things, after talking to one of my buddies who had his daughter in school and he saw the device, there was no security protections on the device whatsoever. And his daughter, I think, was in third grade at the time. So he essentially went through, he took the computer and he completely locked it down to remove and limit that threat surface. That way it's not affecting his network. Now, students are still using computers or still using iPads while they're going to school, and those devices are touching the network. So if there's not much security on the devices for the students, then that is going to essentially leak into the network at the school, where there will be a pivot point. So from the student's device onto the network, and then hackers will then have access or some sort of access or foothold into the network.
The other side to that too is, I think, simply educating the students on what's out there. Right? Like, I wouldn't want to scare a bunch of students and say, someone can track you using your phone. It's going to scare people. But like the legitimate truth of the matter is, it's true. And I don't have to tell a class of second, third graders that someone is watching them at all times, or could be watching them at all times rather. But I can teach them best practice. I can teach them or have a once a week class or something like that to just kind of talk on some of the best practices, which could be, things from simply, don't click links in emails from people you don't know, right? If you're unsure about a link in an email, bring it to a teacher, something like that. Just even the baseline to get their mind there. By the time they get home and, they're on TikTok and they start getting spam messages from people that they don't know, and they accept it because they want to, widen their circle of popularity, presence, whatever it is, it's going to be too late. Their device is now going to become vulnerable due to the activities that they do, because they're simply unaware of the potential threats. And I think you can teach them how to defend themselves against those without necessarily going into the threat itself.
That makes sense. And it's super sensitive to, especially to smaller students, younger students. John and James, where can our listeners learn more about the great work you're doing?
There are a lot of online great resources. James actually is usually one of my go-tos when something new or crazy comes up that I see in the news or hear about or encounter, because he has a wealth of knowledge about this. He teaches people how to defend themselves against actors and environments and how to effectively make yourself invisible. So I love to use James for that. I read a lot. I listen to a lot of podcasts, watch vlogs, things like that, because a lot of the times this moves so quickly. Something that, was a vulnerability that got patched 2 days ago is, months out of date. And that's actually one of the things that, we try and implement in our current solution here at Telos is, as opposed to being reactive to everything that hits your network, why not be proactive, right? If it's changing as fast as it is right now, so should we. We need to be just as responsive. And the only way to do that is to stay educated. So I just open myself up to as many feeds as possible. Absorb, right? I'm addicted to learning everything and anything. And so if it's something I don't know, I latch onto it and I get as much as I can out of it.
James, would you like to add anything?
Yeah. So some valuable resources, just looking at better how to secure your devices, how to making sure you're not using the wrong firewall. Because when you have an antivirus on your computer, it's one of the most invasive things you can have. Basically, you are granting a company full access to every single file, every single piece of data on your computer. And you are just saying you have free reign to see everything here. So making sure you're not using antivirus like Kaspersky, which is owned by Russia, and there's potentially some ill intent there. So if they have access to all of your data, that might not be something you want. So going with either just a standard Windows Defender or using something like AVG. I know Norton, and just saying on top of news. So Norton had some issues with data leakage as well. So just staying on top of that type of things, there's several different news sources, and just looking for anything cyber related. So people are staying on top of the current environment and how things are working.
I wanted to add one more thing on that, just because I think it's just such a very time appropriate example. Year July 2021, Kaseya ransomware attack happened, and so basically it's a virtual system administration tool, and the offenders gained access to that system, and that system, that software, has access to all of these directories, and it's exactly what James just explained. It's got full access to a myriad of things on your system. But it's a trusted entity, just like SolarWinds. These are trusted entities that have been compromised. And it is a very, very common practice. I mean, even in the military background perspective, for example, if you compromise update portal to a virus protection update service or something like that, those pieces of infrastructure that are attributed to that are going to be trusted by your system. And it being compromised is very difficult to identify until after the fact. So again, one of the buzzwords right now is zero trust. But you have to be, in every sense of the manner, zero trust, because you cannot trust anything. Even in the data that James and I look at on a daily basis, I'm looking at all the big names: Google, Amazon, Apple, whoever. Everybody owns cloud infrastructure. A lot of it's compromised. And in many cases, it gets rectified very quickly, but you can't necessarily say that, you're interacting with what you say you're interacting with until you go into, and observe exactly what's happening. And most people don't have the ability to do that. So just be very cognizant of what you're doing. And when you update things like that, be aware of what it has authority to do.
Thank you so much, John and James, for a fascinating discussion. We really appreciate it.
On behalf of the leadership team at COSIN, thank you for listening to this episode of the COSIN podcast. To access other podcasts in this series, visit cosin.org or edcircuit.com for a complete lineup of engaging technology topics. EdCircuit empowers the voices of education with hundreds of trusted contributors, changemakers, and industry-leading education innovators. For more information on MyRocket Media Group, please visit myrocketmediagroup.com to discover how you can be our next satisfied client.